Hi, this is Tom Gillpatrick. We're ready for our second module for the course. This time we're going to explore a process of consumer decision making using a model called the consumer decision journey. And I'll describe this in a few moments. And we will also begin an introduction of culture, which is one of the chapters covered in your textbook. Today we will focus mostly on global culture, but also culture is something that we see everywhere around us here domestically as well. But to start off with, I'd like to ask you three questions from our last presentation, and those questions are, what are the three reasons why marketers are interested in studying consumer behavior? Just to test your memory a bit. And what I will do is just to remind you, and I will do this as we go through the course, but the three main reasons we study consumer behavior in marketing is because we're interested in predicting consumer behavior, we're interested in explaining consumer behavior, the whys of consumer behavior, understanding the motivations of why people behave in the way that they do. And then finally, the third reason we're interested in studying consumer behavior as marketers is we want to be able to influence or control consumer behavior from the standpoint of developing a marketing program that will be motivating to influence consumers to act in ways where we'd like them to act. Another reminder from our last meeting is that we mentioned that consumer behavior is a process. So I will be presenting to you a process model for consumer behavior. In essence, the entire textbook for the course is a process model for consumer behavior. But I think there's some nice analogies, some visuals that we can use to think about this process. So one of the ways, an analogy to think about consumer behavior is that we're interested in understanding, why do consumers behave in the way that they do? And one of the ways we can find out is that we can ask them. However, like the slide that you have in front of you, what consumers say they will do is really the tip of the iceberg. And so as a marketer, as a marketing researcher, we need to dig deeper to understand what are the motivations, what are the values that consumers are interested in. And one of the topics that we will explore today, culture, is really one of those factors that we need to dig into to better understand why consumers behave in the way that they do. So we're going to do, in essence, studying consumer behavior is really a marrying of the topics of economics, of sociology, of psychology, along with marketing implications and market research. So we need to bring research on the consumer together for marketing decision makers to make more informed decisions. So this next slide describes the steps of the consumer decision journey. And again, consumer behavior is a process. So a model that describes the consumer decision process was developed relatively recently, over the last 10 years, and has become popular throughout industry. So friends of mine at Intel, at Nike, at a number of consumer companies, Ziba Design here in Portland, New Seasons grocery store, all have looked at consumer decision journey roadmap to help use that as a model to understand insights and to gain insights in consumer behavior. So how this model works, you'll have a reading as part of your readings packet from McKinsey, which overviews the model, but just to describe it briefly today. This is a model where we're really looking at what are the stages that consumers go through from when they have an idea that there's a need for a new product, a new service, they want to change their life somehow, to if they do recognize they have a need, where can they go to get information? Can they think about it from their memory? Do they need to go online, talk to their best friend? Where do you get information and what kinds of information are gathered? Then we would want to see how those informations are evaluated, understand what specific decision processes consumers use to make a decision, one way or another. And then finally, if you go to a restaurant, if you're on a holiday, or if you buy a new product, a new car, what is your experience and how does that experience feed back? So this model developed by McKinsey, which is the world's probably best known marketing strategy, business strategy really, consulting company, is one that I'll share with you. So this consumer decision journey model, what you see a model which is a recursive or loop model. So it's basically a self-reinforcing model. And of the main stages, what you have in front of you has 4 main stages. Sometimes in business they are called moments of truth. So we're interested in understanding what are the key moments of truth. At what times in the consumer decision journey do we need to be present and having an impact on consumer behavior? So the very first moment of truth is when consumers have your product, your brand inside their minds as a solution to one of their life problems. And sometimes we call this the consideration phase. And research by McKinsey and others has shown that if your company's solution, your brand, your product is not inside your target customer's consideration set initially, that the probability that they will select you goes way down. So one of the marketing challenges that we learned from this, what can we do to be effectively rent space in our target customer's mind so that we will become a brand to be considered? The second phase is really where do we gather information and how do we evaluate that information? So am I going to go online? Am I going to talk to a salesperson? Do I talk to my brother-in-law, my son, my daughter? What kinds of information am I going to use? And then which information sources are considered most credible? And how do those types of information and information sources influence preference formation? How do they influence whether I gather additional information or not? And we will talk further about this. Today, virtually everyone goes online to find out more information about products when they're in a search mode, but that's only part of the process. A third step in the process is consumer decision making. And whether it's a habitual decision, something that we're just doing as almost a rote activity because we've done it hundreds of times before, or is it maybe a more limited problem solving? I have a mobile phone, but I need a new one. I need to evaluate providers, handset companies, and we would call that more of a limited problem solving kind of decision process. Or maybe it's a decision that there's considerable risk, economic risk, social risk, physical risk. There's a number of different categories of risk that we can look at. And I really want to put more energy, more time and effort to reduce the risk of making a bad decision. So understanding the decision process. So a extended decision process would be employed when consumers have a perception that there's substantial risk. Buying a house, buying a car are typical examples for that. And finally, once we have made a selection, is understanding the consumer experience process. And there's a great deal more effort put in marketing today in businesses in general for doing research on understanding what is the consumer experience and what are implications for us as marketers to improve the consumer experience so that they have a good experience and will be more likely to purchase our products, to select our service in the future, or to recommend to friends and family that we are a solution. So this becomes a recursive process that goes again and again. And the stronger our experience, if we're going to remain in that consideration set, the probability is reinforced. So we call this a positive feedback loop in marketing. So again, looking at these stages and identifying what are the critical stages, this initial consideration set. According to McKinsey, 70% of the solutions that customers choose are in their initial consideration set. So as I said a moment ago, the probability of your product, your service being selected dramatically goes down if we're not in a consumer's consideration set. We'll talk later more about this consideration set. We'll talk more about the evaluation process. And the moment of purchase, what goes into the moment of purchase? If we're in a store, understanding that environment, understanding what situational factors. Are we shopping alone, with friends, with family, with our kids? Is the task, is it something for ourselves? Is it a routine task? Is it a gift that we're giving someone that we care about? Really understanding what drives that decision and the moment of purpose. And again, we go back into this feedback loop. And hopefully, if we have a good feedback, what we create is a loyalty loop. We reinforce the associations between brand, a good solution, and how we adjust our behavior in the future. For a marketer, what can I learn from this? Well, I'm going to learn what are the critical moments in the consumer's decision journey that I need to be there, I need to plug in. In today's world, in a world that is really 24/7 potential exposure to consumers given a digital domain, we really need to sort through all the possible moments of contact with our target customer and select which ones are the ones that we're going to focus our budgets. Which ones are we going to focus to build a relationship with our consumer? So identifying the right moments, which might be, as we said, the initial consideration. It could be trying to build an active evaluation process. It can really be trying to reinforce the loyalty loop through a very excellent experience that consumers have with us. Along with this, we're interested in developing the right messages, understanding consumer motivations, understanding the social dynamics of a consumer decision process, understanding where our target customers are with respect to demographics and psychographics, to really help use that information about consumer psychology, about consumer psychographic information, about consumer lifestyles to help us craft a message that will be in the right media at the right time with the right appeal that's going to be motivating for our target customers. And how do we build an emotional relationship? How can we help instill trust between us and our target audience? And one of the findings that McKinsey discusses is trust is increasingly becoming an important dimension between buyers and sellers. We might also look at things about the appeal of the message. What aspects of the appeal should be rational? What aspects should be emotional? And how do we balance rational appeals with emotional appeals? I'm of the belief that much of our behavior is emotionally driven, but we will explore that in some more depth. What are the right media to use? Television, direct mail, which social media? These are all decisions that we get from studying consumer decision processes, along with reinforcing that experience that we've talked about, that give us insights on what to do and also give us insights on what marketing capabilities we need to develop to be effective in reaching our target customers. Okay, so the first topic I was introducing today, and that goes along with the reading that's assigned, is the consumer decision journey process, something that you should be familiar with. Your textbook, and as a format for the book, as I described in our last module, is really understanding this model of consumer behavior. This model that has external factors, that's followed by, which is part 1 of your textbook, followed by psychological factors, which is part 2 of your textbook, how do both external and internal factors combine to provide consumer lifestyles. How can we learn as marketers from consumer lifestyles which decision processes consumers use to choose our product? How should we try to influence those decision processes? What different situational factors are influential? How can we work on that consumer experience post-purchase, etc.? But the main point here is consumer decision making is a process. And as a marketer, we need to develop an intimate understanding of our customers' decision processes to develop insights from that research. One of the very first external factors that I want to talk about today is really looking at the concept of culture. We're surrounded in culture. Culture can be international culture, and I will focus primarily on some cross-culture or international cultural dimensions today, but also we'll develop continually because culture exists here in Portland. It's different if you're living in the suburbs, if you're living an urban life. It's going to be different if you're on the west side of the Willamette or the east side, or if you're in Eugene, if you're in southern Oregon, if you're living outside of Oregon, or in some other part of the world. Culture is a factor that influences behavior. It influences consumer decision processes, and it's something that we want to study to be able to predict, explain, and influence behavior. So what is culture? Just a few definitions of culture, so we're all on the same page. One important factor is culture is learned. We learn culture. It's learned behavior. It's not inherent. It's not like a law of physics. Culture is completely arbitrary. We learn it from our family, from being small children. We learn it from going to school all of our lives, from our work environments, through our friends, if we've served in the military, if we've served in other organizations. They all influence the culture and cultural learning that we have. If I go to work for an athletic and outdoor company, it's going to likely be a different culture than if I'm working for a technology company, particularly a hardware technology company, or a law firm, or an accounting firm. So we have culture within the organizations where we work, that are suppliers, that are our customers, as well as ultimately consumers in the environment that we hope to deliver products and service with. Culture, to be more important, more impactful, should be shared. So usually when we talk about culture, we're interested in how broadly cultural values are shared, or perhaps how narrowly cultural values are shared. Along with the breadth and just how focused cultural values are is also the depth. They can be shallow, but they can also be very deeply held cultural values. So how deeply and how widely shared by society are the values that influence our behavior? Cultural values and culture typically is patterned. This is helpful for when we're involved in market segmentations or profiling different customers, because we can see different patterns of behaviors. Culture is acquired, as I said, by learning and through cultural interaction. It's a process. So, if you've lived and traveled outside of your initial country, you've worked abroad, maybe you've come to America as your travel abroad as being here, you learn more. It influences you. If you work in a company, it influences you. Along with this culture, there's a lot of cultural symbolism. Is something that we're interested in studying and marketing. Cultural symbolism is important in promotion. Perhaps we're all familiar with logos that are used in marketing. What is the symbolic meaning of logos? Or a lot of marketing is event focused. It might be around holiday season at Christmas or Easter, or coming up, it might be Valentine's Day or 4th of July or Veterans Day. What are the cultural symbols? Here in America, if our target market is outside of America, what are the key cultural symbols that we need to be aware of? And then finally, culture is something that sometimes we don't think about very much. We internalize it. It sort of tells us what's right and what's wrong. From my view, cultural gives us a roadmap. Culture provides a roadmap of how we navigate our daily lives. It tells us what's right, what's wrong. One dimension of culture is that if we violate cultural norms, there may be sanctions for violating those norms. Sometimes the sanctions, if it's not a value that's deeply held, maybe are pretty small. We may have other cultural values that are deeply held, and if we violate those cultural norms, there are some sanctions that society gives us for those violations. So understanding culture, again, is useful for us. Some examples of terminology used in culture, and I'm not going to go through all of these. I'll pull some examples out. There's a number of them talked about in your text, but as a marketer, I want to understand if all of these aren't important, which ones will be more important for me? So I really need to do, when I conduct a situation analysis of how I plan to market my product, to understand what kind of cultural dimensions, symbolism may be important for me. So it could be a cultural artifact, which could be a product that's symbolic of our culture. Could be attitudes that we have in our culture. You know, most societies have sayings, have proverbs that sort of tell us what is correct and maybe what is not correct. You know, Benjamin Franklin in American culture provided a list of proverbs for us. And all cultures around the world have a version of proverbs, or which go along with beliefs, cultural beliefs, beliefs in American values. I will share with you in our next module a little bit more specifically about values in culture, specifically American values and how they may be changing. As I said, there may be sanctions if you deviate from cultural norms. Kind of going through cultural norms are the rules of culture. So an example of an American rule of culture would be if you're talking to someone, you're having a conversation a two-way, it's considered rude if a third person walks up and interrupts. Interrupting someone else's conversation is not appropriate. That cultural norm might even be more important if you interrupt a conversation between your supervisor and her boss, because you're really violating a couple cultural norms. So there could be sanctions for that. If I go on a business dinner, in America it's generally considered impolite to burp at dinner. Now probably you're not going to be fired if you burp, but if you burp often at dinner, you may run the risk, the sanction, of not being invited to dinner anymore. So again, culture provides a rule set of how we live. We role play in culture. We all look at the roles we have, the role of a parent, the role of a colleague. In America, we have roles in organizations. If we're an officer in an organization, we have a fiduciary role within the organization that we play. Again, cultural norms alongside legal standards for where we are. But cultural norms can be just as important in many cases. The next module after this one, we'll talk more specifically and dig into value aspects of culture.